You look at the world around us right now, and we've got the kind of technology at our fingers in these phones we have that, would have been like pure magic to our ancestors. And yet, even with all of that incredible technology and learning, we still make ourselves more depressed, more unhappy. We've got the highest levels of anxiety and depression among young people because just the knowledge, the learning doesn't make you more wise, doesn't make you necessarily a happier person, doesn't. And it's one of those things where I just think, how long does it take before we realize we can't do it ourselves?
What's up, everybody? This is Lisa Fields, the founder and president of the Jude 3 Project, and these are 5 highlights from 2023. Number 5, we released a critical and important curriculum for parents to talk to their teens about gender and sexuality in partnership with Access. This curriculum has reached thousands of parents across the country and helped them have better conversations with their teens about gender and sexuality. Number 4, we released a mini doc telling my story and the Jude 3 Project story earlier this year, and it's reached thousands of people across the globe. Number 3, Courageous Conversations 2023 was amazing success, our best year yet. This year, we focused on how to reconstruct after deconstructing your faith. And we have so many testimonies of countless people that have been blessed by Courageous Conversations in person and virtually, and continue to be blessed through our on-demand option. Number 2, as you know, we released our Juneteenth documentary last year, but this year it got picked up by PBS and was available in millions of homes across the country on Juneteenth of this year. That is so amazing. God is so good. And number 1, I am so excited that our Unspoken documentary was picked up by Tubi this year, so it's available free to anyone who wants to watch it and reaches our target audience of skeptics who are struggling with this idea that Christianity is a white man's religion. And that's not all. This month, it was picked up by Fox Soul and aired on national television for the first time, available in millions of homes across the world. We could not do what we do at the Jude 3 Project without you. We have so much lined up next year. I have a book coming out next year that I'm excited to tell y'all about, When Faith Disappoints, the gap between what we believe and what we experience. And there's so much more that we have lined up for 2024. The amazing thing about 2024 is our 10-year anniversary. Jude 3 turns 10, 2024. And so we want to encourage you to stay tuned to all of our socials, subscribe to our newsletter for the exciting things we have coming up in 2024. Thank you for helping us reach these milestones this year. And if you want to continue to help the mission and vision of the Jude 3 Project and help us finish this year strong, or if you see this in the new year to help us continue the work we do for the Jude 3 Project, you can give online at jude3project.org/donate. You have the option to give online, or there's an address to mail your check in person. Every gift you give helps equip. We could not do what we do without you. So thank you. We appreciate you, and more to come. Grace and peace, and God bless. Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by Justin Brierley. He is an author, a speaker. Would you're an apologist as well, Justin?
I like to think of myself as maybe, I don't, yes. I don't think of myself as an apologist in the way you are, Lisa, because you really kind of are out there kind of defending the faith, in all kinds of scenarios. I've always been more of a host of apologetics discussions. I've usually been letting other people do the apologetics, and I'm just learning on the side. But occasionally I'm in the midst of it, actually kind of making the arguments myself. So yeah.
So you've highlighted a little bit about yourself. Just tell the audience a little bit more about who you are, your journey.
Well, a lot of people may know me from a show called Unbelievable, which I hosted for 17 and a half years. And that was really a radio show, podcast, video show that brought Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate, based here in the UK. but we had kind of guests from all over the world. And it was very frequently atheists and Christians in dialogue and debate, but also other worldviews, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and so on. So that was kind of really where I learned kind of, how to defend faiths, the arguments for and against Christianity, that kind of thing. And in the process of doing that, I sort of, as I say, picked up a bit myself, was able to write a book at about the 10-year mark of hosting that show called Unbelievable Why, After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. And so, yeah, that was kind of how I got into it, how my own journey developed. And I guess that gave me a good sort of ringside seat to a lot of the conversations going on in our culture around faith and belief. To the extent that only very recently, having moved on from hosting the Unbelievable show after 17 years, my newest project is actually kind of looking at the way the conversations have changed in our culture recently. So a new book and podcast called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, looking at the sort of rise and fall of new atheism as a movement, but also the way that I think there's a new conversation emerging in our culture around God, especially some interesting secular intellectuals who are increasingly talking about God in very positive ways, even if they're not believers themselves. So all of that is keeping me very busy at the moment.
Yes. We've talked about several times on this podcast about how atheism is not a prominent thing in the African American community, but it is growing. When we think about atheism and the ways in which it has grown, what in different spaces, what is the common thread that you see that leads people to atheism?
I mean, if I'm honest, I often think it just is the default for a lot of people in our culture. I mean, I would say that's especially true here in the UK, where, the influence of Christianity has been waning over many generations, really. And to that extent, a lot of people, they might not use the word atheism, but that's kind of their default mode for a lot of people. They don't have any particular religious belief and so on. And so I think there's a sense in which it was sort of, intensified during the early 2000s, especially. And that was during this kind of new atheist moment where you had some really well-known figures like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, the four so-called horsemen of new atheism, really kind of taking some public stages, having a lot of airtime. There was a real growth in a kind of online atheist movement alongside that, but they were writing these best-selling books. And I think that kind of helped to kind of, a lot of people who maybe were just non-religious suddenly started to kind of think of themselves more as atheists, more as, specifically people who didn't believe in God. And I think for a time it was even kind of, it felt quite edgy and cool and, the thing to do and to call yourself. So to that extent, I think there was this kind of, it was in vogue to kind of, to specifically think of yourself as atheist. So I think that it's come from there, but generally I'd say in the West generally, but especially, in my country, in the UK, there's been a kind of a general secularization that means that atheism, even if it isn't called that, is the kind of de facto option that most people just kind of find themselves falling into in that way.
You described something you call new atheism. What is the difference between new atheism and a older version of atheism?
I think the real difference is just that it was a lot more public, a lot more dogmatic. It was not afraid to use ridicule when it came to critiquing religion. So you would find, Richard Dawkins on stage at the Reason Rally in 2012, encouraging, this audience of tens of thousands on the Mall in Washington, D.C. to mock and to ridicule religion. And that's what a lot of people have done. I think of some broadcasters like Ricky Gervais in my country, who's an atheist. He will do stand-up routines where he's kind of mocking the Bible. Maybe, in the US, Bill Maher, was well known for documentaries like Religulous, where he kind of really just, parodied and so on. So I think it was that sort of, that very dismissive sort of way of looking at religion that probably typified new atheism. And I think that was quite difficult, I think, for a lot of Christians to deal with, because it's one thing to sort of try to give an answer to an atheist, someone who's willing to listen, if you like, and to engage. But I think it's much harder when you feel like you're just being mocked or patronized and so on. And sadly, I think a lot of Christians kind of responded in kind, and in turn kind of would try to kind of use the same kind of weapons. But I never think that's a very good idea, because in the end, that's not ultimately what we're called to do.
So we had a guest on, I don't know if he was ever on Unbelievable, but he wrote a book called Faith of the Fatherless. He was a psychologist who studied basically the father relationship between most atheists and their fathers. And he discovered that many of them had challenging relationships with their fathers. And he kind of made this connection. And I thought that was fascinating, that there was some kind of trauma that he felt like most prominent atheists had that led them to believing that God didn't exist.
I've heard of that book, and I never had the author on, but it did come up once or twice in discussions, this kind of theory, a kind of psychological theory, I guess, that a kind of bad relationship with your father, or not having a father figure, kind of could lead to a propensity for atheism. I guess I was always a bit wary of deploying that one in a conversation, because it could immediately set the wrong tone potentially, because there is always that danger, I suppose, of, rather than addressing the arguments of the atheist, kind of making something more like an ad hominem. Well, you just believe what you believe because you had a difficult childhood or something. And I think it's, I'm slightly wary of employing that, because I wouldn't want to cause offense, when I'm trying to reach someone who doesn't share. But at the same time, of course, I think we're all a mixture of intellectual, psychological, emotional, spiritual causes that bring us to who we are. So I think I think even, the most rational atheist would have to admit that, of course, there's going to be psychological influences that may drive people towards faith or away from faith. I think it's useful to know when to kind of bring that in, because there's going to be times when it's going to be less helpful, if you know what I mean.
I wouldn't bring it in unless the person brought it in. You have to lead them kind of on a journey of questions for them to kind of get there, versus you leading them there, because I think that would go bad. Because then they would think you're not answering my questions intellectually. I'm bringing you intellectual questions. You're trying to make it about emotion.
And I guess there's always the possibility that they could turn that on you and say, well, maybe you're just a Christian because, I don't know, you had mother issues or something. I guess someone could always come up with some psychological reason why you've adopted your perspective. Now, I do agree. I think we shouldn't dismiss that, because I think we're all a mixture of things. So why not look at those reasons for why we do or don't believe?
When you think of atheism and all the discussions that you've had over the years with Unbelievable, what is the best mix of a response to someone who's navigating atheism?
It will depend a lot on the person. So I meet lots of atheists who are atheists for a variety of different reasons. Some of them, it is because they have some kind of bad experience of religion, and so the thing that you need to get to is what happened and the specific reason that they left the faith because of that. It's not necessarily because they've got a really good argument against God. It might be more a kind of an emotional or an issue tied up with something that happened. But I do meet people, for whom they're kind of maybe somewhat open to the idea of God. They just don't believe that Jesus could have risen from the dead. Or I meet someone for whom the problem of evil is the big thing. So there's going to be different reasons for every different type of atheist, And so I think the real helpful thing is having the conversation and not just treating everyone as the same, and hopefully getting to a kind of a conversation that's actually helpful for that individual. The place I would often want to get to, well, one of the things that I found most helpful, though, in navigating these conversations is to realize that we all come to life with a worldview, with a way of looking at life. And I think when I started Unbelievable, back in the very early days, and I was just learning as I went along how this whole apologetics thing went, I'd kind of imbibed the view that as a Christian, all the burden of proof was on me, to prove these strange beliefs in God and heaven and the supernatural. But what I realized actually increasingly was that the atheist guests themselves would have a set of assumptions or beliefs about the way life is, about the universe. And they also needed to give an account of that. So it wasn't just that the Christian had to defend all of their beliefs. There's a set of beliefs tied up with what you might call naturalism or materialism, the view that all that exists ultimately is matter in motion and the physical laws of the universe. Because if that's the way life is, then that's got all kinds of consequences to it. It means we live in a universe which essentially came from nowhere and is heading nowhere, where there's no ultimate purpose in the universe. There's no ultimate meaning to life. Those things, if they exist, are just kind of inventions by us. There's nothing such as, true justice, right or wrong. These are kind of, again, illusions, if you like, that are kind of just, we've created just as useful ways of getting on in life. There's all kinds of consequences of a very strictly atheistic worldview. And what I discovered was it's just as important to ask the questions of an atheist about how they make sense of life on their worldview as it is for them to be able to ask the Christian. And I think, as I say, because a lot of people do kind of adopt atheism as a kind of default, they never actually even think of it that way. They never question it. They just think, well, I just don't believe in God. That's all atheism is. But actually, for most people, it is actually a lot more than that. And I think in the end, the question is, well, look, does Christianity or atheism make best sense of the evidence that's available to all of us? And when I increasingly kind of looked at sort of the way the universe seems to be set up to produce us, the way that we seem to have these moral intuitions that there is such a thing as true, right and wrong, value, human rights. And as I looked at the way that across all times and places, people seem to have a common idea of a transcendent source of purpose and meaning in the universe, I thought, well, all of those things actually, in the end, seem to stack up better against a Christian worldview than against this materialist worldview. So I think when you look at it in that way, you can have a really interesting conversation with an atheist, because then you're saying, well, let's compare and contrast our two worldviews in that way.
No, that's extremely, extremely helpful. And I think that leads to my next question on kind of what you're seeing in this new movement as it relates to atheism, how people are trying to find the answers to those questions you're laying out that have identified as atheists in the past. And they're like, I need to have some kind of framework. Am I communicating kind of your new project direction correctly?
Yeah, I think you are. And I think the thing that sort of I really lay out in the book and this new podcast documentary series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is that I think the new atheism, it was kind of new and exciting, and it had its moment, in the popular press and media, but it kind of did fade from view actually almost as quickly as it arose. And I think there's a variety of reasons. I think firstly, there were all kinds of internal issues that led to it kind of internally unraveling. But also I think it ultimately didn't answer people's questions. I think there's still just a kind of an existential question people have, which is, what is the purpose of life? And if the answer is there is no purpose to life, you just have to kind of invent it for yourself, I think that's really difficult for people to actually put into practice, because I don't think we're made to kind of live in a kind of do it yourself story. I think we're very much conditioned. We're made to live in a story where we have a sense that there is a kind of beginning, middle, and an end. There is a point, I have a meaningful part to play in something that's bigger than me. But the problem with the atheist story of reality is that there is no such story. It really is just random, and you just got to kind of make the best of it. And hey, and if the cards don't fall your way, that's just tough. That's just the way it is. And I think most people just sense that actually that doesn't make sense of their actual experience of life. So, I mean, one good example of this is you may have heard the story fairly recently of a woman called Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was one of these new atheist figures. She is a Somali-born, now Dutch sort of thinker, politician, who was very much, because she came out of a very fundamentalist Islamic background, she kind of turned against God and against religion. and became in the mid 2000s part of the new atheist set of thinkers. So she was sharing stages with Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and others. She wrote this book called Infidel, but extraordinarily, just, in November last year, she wrote this viral article called Why I Am Now a Christian. And so Ayaan Hirsi Ali, having been, one of these new atheists, was now describing herself as a Christian. And she gave a number of reasons for this, a number of which kind of were quite sort of cultural and political, the way that she felt that atheism, secular humanism just doesn't provide enough of a kind of a bulwark against what she sees as some big threats, from fundamentalist Islam, from sort of world powers, hegemonic powers like Russia and China and so on. But she also talked about at a personal level that she just couldn't eventually find that atheism gave her enough reason for living. It just was not enough to explain what you're here for, what the purpose of life is. And she said those questions just actually never went away. And she gives a very kind of moving interview about this as well, where she talks about the fact that she kind of found herself like spiritually bankrupt, and she just realized that she had this sense that she needed to have something bigger than herself. And she found that in the Christian story eventually. So I just think that story is happening more and more in our culture. People who maybe tried atheism, tried to kind of do the whole kind of science and reason that gives you enough to kind of base your life on. I think they're just running out of steam, and they're finding, I'm still depressed. I'm still not, this hasn't answered my questions. I still need something bigger than myself to live for. And that's why I think people, in my view, have now left that kind of new atheist thinking. I think it still exists in certain corners of the internet, but it's in no way the kind of cultural force it was, 15 or 20 years ago. And that's why I think you're seeing a lot of these new intellectuals, psychologists, lots of other people talking about the value of religion, the way it does give us a sense of meaning and purpose and identity, and what we lose when we lose something like the Christian story in our culture. So that's where I think the kind of the movement has gone in recent years.
Yeah, no, I think, when I think about the importance of purpose, some kind of reason for us being here, if you don't have a faith that kind of gives you the framework, the worldview, part of that is why are we here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Then it can feel like hopeless, because life is so hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
For so many people, and there's different degrees of hard. And when you're suffering, you try to make sense of what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
And so it's important for, I can imagine people who are atheists to find some kind of reason to make sense of the suffering and pain that they experience.
Yeah. I think this is the thing with Christianity is some people reject Christianity because of suffering and pain, and because they can't obviously make sense of it. If there is a loving God, it's the old problem of evil, but it doesn't get rid of the problem of suffering. You will still encounter suffering. It's just that the answer atheism puts on it is that it's meaningless. There is no rhyme or reason. And I don't think that kind of might solve the problem intellectually, but it doesn't solve it at a kind of experiential level.
Yeah.
And that's really what Christianity does. It says, look, I'm not, there are obviously, we know, philosophical arguments and responses to the problem of evil. But at its core, the real answer in the Christian faith is that you've got someone who's with you in your suffering. It's like you're not alone. And that's the problem. That's the big difference for me between Christianity and atheism. Atheism says you are basically alone. And, it's just the way life is. Some people get lucky, some don't, whereas while we don't deny in any way that suffering is a great evil in the Christian story, we also say there's going to be a redemption of it. And the reason you can get through it is because there's a God who knows what it is to suffer, who came with you into your suffering. And that alone, far more than any kind of grand philosophical explanation might be the one thing that keeps someone going when they're in that place of suffering. So for me, it's like, there's frequently I find people who have actually been drawn towards faith through suffering rather than being turned away from it. It's because they need something like that to make sense of it. And I just don't think atheism has the resources to answer, to give any kind of a comfort that, something that can psychologically help someone get through in that way.
Yeah. Or the presence of someone, when I think of suffering, one of the most helpful, hopeful things about it is that we have a God that suffered with us. So he doesn't circumvent the process of suffering. He suffers with us. And in the presence of our suffering, what gives us hope is a suffering savior. And so atheists don't have that hope that comes with knowing that we have a God that suffered with us, that can identify and intercede for us in our suffering. And so, I just think of how much, if I didn't have God, how hopeless and empty I would feel in the midst of pain. And so I think, sometimes people are intimidated sometimes to even talk to atheists. Christians are intimidated because if people are atheists because of like science and trying to reconcile science and faith, there's an intimidation. I don't know enough to be able to communicate for most Christians. And it's like, but you still, when you're talking about how people are trying to find, like you said, the atheists, like what is the reason for my existence? You do have something to offer, even if you cannot on an intellectual level engage somebody who may be a chemist that's an atheist. You might feel intimidated, but you do have something to offer.
Yeah. I mean, one of the responses I sometimes hear to this is from some atheists, at least, is, oh, well, then you just believe Christianity because you need a crutch. You need something just to help you get through life. And, and I don't need that crutch, I'm kind of, and my answer to that is kind of, well, a crutch can be really useful if you've got a broken leg. You need a crutch, and I think we are broken people. And that's the whole point, is like, you can kind of get so far in life saying I can just do this by myself under my own power. But actually we all reach a point where we run out of our own resources. And I'm quite happy to say Christianity is a crutch because I'm a broken person. I need more than just myself. I can't do it in my own power. And I just meet more and more people who I think are getting to that place, realizing, the more that we employ technology and science and our cleverness, the more we seem to prove to ourselves that will not save us. The more of a mess we tend to actually make this world. You look at the world around us right now, and we've got the kind of technology at our fingers in these phones we have that, would have been like pure magic to our ancestors. And yet, even with all of that incredible technology and learning, we still make ourselves more depressed, more unhappy. We've got the highest levels of anxiety and depression among young people because just the knowledge, the learning doesn't make you more wise, doesn't make you necessarily a happier person, doesn't. And it's one of those things where I just think, how long does it take before we realize we can't do it ourselves? And it's almost like every generation seems to need to learn this again, that actually we're kind of, it's not a bad thing. It's not a failing to need a savior. It's actually just the way we're made. We can't do it ourselves,
Yeah, no, that's good. Because as you were talking about the crutch, a part of one of the first things to get saved is to realize that you're broken and need a savior, that you need the crutch. And so if you think you don't need the crutch, then you're not ready for salvation. It's till you come to the knowledge that you actually are broken, that need a crutch, that you can actually get the help that you need. And so I love that illustration. I'm going to be using that and quoting you. As it relates to your book and your new project, the documentary, what do you want people to get out of this work when they look through the documentary, read the book? What do you want them to take away? Well, first I'll say, what do you want atheists to take away and what do you want Christians to take away?
Yeah, and it's good to kind of differentiate those, because I think there will be different things that people are coming to this with. I guess for someone who's not a Christian, who's listening to the documentary series on podcast or reading the book, I would hope it would give them just a reason to think about whether we can survive as a culture, as individuals, without some kind of a story to make sense of life. That's at the center of the book, really, is this idea that we need a story to make sense of life. And what I argue in the book is that we once did have a common story, especially, in the West by and large, which was this Christian story, which came to, shape all of our kind of imagination, our moral instincts. And yet in the last, couple of centuries, that story has started to fade from view as we've had this increasing secularism. But the problem is that it's not like, G.K. Chesterton had this famous saying that when people stop believing in God, they don't then believe in nothing. They have the capacity to believe in anything. And that's what I think we're seeing in our culture. We're actually seeing people aren't any less religious. They just kind of get religious about different things. And so you haven't had a kind of a mass conversion to kind of a scientific, rational atheism. You've got a lot of people who are now kind of experimenting with all kinds of other sort of, New Eastern, New Age type religions, a bit of this, a bit of that, but also actually just other stories that are kind of taking the place of God in people's lives. It could be a kind of materialist story. It could be like politics. It could be a particular ideology. It could be a kind of social cause. People always put something basically in the place of God, because we can't live without something like that. We have to make sense of our life somehow. And so, but I think the stories that people are reaching for to try and make sense of their life are kind of growing increasingly thin. They can't sustain us. There's nothing wrong with, political activism, but if that is your God, it will let you down and you will become a very unhappy person, because in that religion, there's no grace. There's no room for messing up and coming and kind of finding forgiveness. And you need that as a human. So I think we're kind of reaching a stage as we've forgotten the Christian story, but people are trying to make sense of their life through all these other kind of quasi-religious stories, where actually I want to say to the atheist or non-Christian, is there a better story? In fact, could that old story that maybe you discounted be the story that actually does make sense? And hopefully they may see some of the stories and hear some of the testimonies of some of the people I interview for the book and the show, who themselves were in that place, were trying to make it by themselves, trying to make sense of life through the story that they were inhabiting, but they found it ultimately didn't make sense. And they, to their very great surprise, found that the Christian story was the story that did make sense of their life. And I just am finding more and more of those people, just encountering more and more of those people, as I say, especially as that new atheist sort of phase has tailed off. I just feel like something's changed in the atmosphere. There's a kind of a new openness, a new readiness for some people to try God, to just see whether there's something in this. So I would just encourage the kind of agnostic, curious person who may be thinking, well, I'm not sure, dip a toe in, see what happens when you actually open up the Bible, when you try praying, when you maybe join a church community and see what happens. You might be surprised. For the Christian who's watching or reading, I guess my hope is that they will go away encouraged that even though we see a lot of bad news in our media about the church, about Christianity, and I'm not saying there isn't things to be worried about, there are. I think there are some bad directions that we can go in. But I want to sound a note of hope, which is just to say God isn't finished with the church. The church can often go off in lots of crazy directions, unhelpful directions. But God, I believe, often, the story of the church, again, is just a story of something that keeps on dying but keeps getting reborn again. And the reason it does is because it has a God who died and got, raised to life again. So I just feel like what I'm trying to kind of sketch out in this book is maybe we're in one of those dying and rebirth phases in the life of the church. And what you see as kind of, everyone's losing their faith, that everyone's deconstructing. It's all kind of, there's all these scandals in the church. I agree with all of that. But I also sense that God's doing something new, that there is actually a kind of a new wave of interest and openness to God, to Christianity. And let's not lose sight of that, because actually sometimes we're so focused on the bad news that we fail to see what God might be doing actually. And I see this especially among the younger generation. I don't know if that's your experience, Lisa, but I think they're really hungry to hear some good news again, because I feel like they've been starved of kind of meaning and just a sense of purpose and identity. They're really confused about who they're meant to be. And I just feel like there is actually an open door potentially for the church. If we can get this right, if we can get over our tribalism and politicization and everything else that does exist, I just feel like there's a door, and we need to sort of see what's behind it, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I'm very, very hopeful for the next generation and what God will do and the opportunities that are there. Justin, I mean, I think you've laid it out beautifully, but do you have any closing words outside of the words that you've already shared? And just tell everyone where they can get your book and access to the docuseries.
Oh, well, thank you for the opportunity to come on. Yeah, I would just encourage folk who are feeling, you know, like there's a lot going on in our culture and it's difficult. It is. It's always been difficult, though. Every generation has faced its own challenges, and we will face ours. But I do believe in a God who works through a very big picture. And sometimes we only see our little slice of the picture, but there's a much bigger picture, I think. And I guess Christian history has always been a history of, as I say, of death and rebirth. And that's what I'm trying to express in this book and this podcast series, is that there's something new stirring. And I think we need to take notice of it. And maybe that means we need to start, you know, looking at the questions this generation has. And sometimes we're caught answering the questions of a previous generation. Maybe it will change the way that we need to think about how we do church and how we meet. You know, if there is a tide of kind of meaning seeking millennials, Gen Z coming, then we need to be ready for that. So, so I hope it'll be a challenge and an encouragement. If you want to find out more, if you want to get hold of the book, if you want to listen to the documentary series, if you want to get hold of my newsletter and get updates that way, the easiest place to go is justinbrierley.com, which is my website, and go there for the book, for the podcast, and for the newsletter.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Remember, you can catch all of our podcast episodes at Jew3project.org or wherever you stream your podcasts, or on our YouTube channel. You can get merch, everything, resources at Jew3project.org. You can give online at Jew3project.org by hitting that donate tab. The option to give by mail or to give online is all there. Remember, here at the Jew3 Project, we're helping you to know what you believe and why you believe it. Until next time, grace and peace and God bless.
What's up, everyone? Lisa Fields here, and I'm so excited about our curriculum, Courageous Conversations. You heard about our popular conference, Courageous Conversations, where we invite the leading pastors, thought leaders, and scholars from conservative and progressive backgrounds for conversations. But we not only want to have those conversations on stage at the conference, but we want you to have them in your everyday life. So we developed a curriculum for you to do just that. Courageous Conversations curriculum, the tools you need for the conversations in culture. You can get that today on Amazon or on our website at Jew3project.org.